Alright, serious business. So, if you've been writing in Elixir and you're trying to write tests, you've probably come across this article by Jose where he says, don't use mocks. And I know what you're saying. You're saying, I like mocks and I know what I'm doing. You're wrong. You're wrong. Don't make me call your friends. I'll call your friends and I'll tell them you don't know how to program right. Now it's important to differentiate that the mocks he's talking about are the kind that override default behavior. And he goes on to talk about why that's bad, especially in Elixir, because you modify a global module and now you can't run your tests asynchronously anymore because you're modifying it for everyone. If you're talking about mocks as in like a stub that you write that you use just for testing and it stands on its own, that's a different story. In fact, he goes on to show two different methods for using your own stubbed implementation to use in your tests. So we're going to talk about those. Alright, well, let's say we want to test a to-do list. Let's look at what this thing is. It's a module. It's got an items function. Looks like it reads from a to-do.txt. We can look at that, and it's just a couple of items in here, no big deal. Reads it and then calls this private function and splits it on new lines. That's pretty much it. So nothing crazy there, except what if I want to test different contents of the file, right? Now here's my boggle. So basically, because line 5 is using the file module directly, we can't really change its behavior, and we don't want to. But what we can do is use Jose's first recommendation, and probably one that you'll see quite a bit, where you can retrieve the module that you should use at runtime from app-config. So here's what that looks like. Basically, line 5 here, we're going to go out to app-config, and we're going to look for a value that we've configured, which I added to my test EXS. So this will only work in test, which is really all we want. And we just give it the name of this stub here, which actually, if you go down here into my test now, I have this added. And I'm basically just mimicking the behavior of file.read, right? So I can just put a static value in here, really kind of do whatever I want to make that work. Also, instead of reaching for file directly, we just call the result of this. Now also we default to the file module here, so that in production, in any environment that shouldn't be for testing, we'll use the actual file module. Now there's a lot of cases where this isn't really flexible enough. The one downside of it, for example, is that you can only really have one stub, right? So if you have scenarios where you want to use different stubs with different behavior to test different scenarios, that's a lot harder to do with this because you get one and that's it. It's configured globally. So with that said, I think we'll move on now to the next method, which is injection. So here's what we changed so we can do an injected local. Just add a parameter to your function and default it. And then we'll just use whatever's passed in as our file module. And if nothing's passed, you just call items normally, then it'll default to file. What's neat about this now, in our test, we just call items and we pass it our stub. And we can define many of these now, so it's quite a bit more flexible. Now if you're being kind of picky, then you might wonder, well, how do I know that the implementation isn't just hard coding these results? Well, one thing you can do, it's a nice little trick, is you can send self some kind of message. So we'll just say read and file name. So what this will do is it will send the current process a tuple, and we're just picking a name here, I'm matching it to the function name, and then I'm passing the parameter. So what this will do now is in our test, we can actually say assert receive, and now this is just built in to XUnit, and then you can give it the thing you're looking for. So we're looking for read, and we're looking for todo.txt. So this message will get pattern matched, so as long as it matches the pattern, you're good to go. Alright, so now we're looking pretty good. I added a new test here, and this one looks for empty files that return an empty list, and now I'm injecting an empty stub file. So I set that up right here, and its contents are just an empty string, and then some the same boilerplate stuff. The only problem here is that this is getting a little bit tedious. I mean, I've only covered 2 scenarios, and I have like 20 lines of setup just to do that. And it's not like this is an uncommon thing to test, right? The other problem with doing this is that what if we had asynchronous work going on? But what if our stub actually gets called in another process? So maybe something like this, where we're reading the file in an async task, or maybe we're testing a gen server, or it spawns a process for some reason. Anything that would cause a process to be spawned would make this send self thing not work anymore, so then it kind of breaks that little hack that we're doing in order to make sure that the method's called with the right arguments and all that. So it kind of kills that. The other downside of this stubbing manually is that it's really hard to set up scenarios where you have one stub that you want to set up behaviors where you call it subsequent times to return different results. For example, I call it one time, it returns 3 items. I call it a second time, it returns 5. And that scenario is really hard to set up here because, we're in a functional language and you'd have to set up another process to hold state and all that. So it gets to be pretty tedious. Now I know I'm poking holes in this and showing where it gets kind of painful, but in some cases it might be fine, and you should totally start with this. Both methods are valid, and if you don't feel pain in what you're doing, then don't worry about it. But if you are doing the manual stubbing and you get to a point where it's just too much setup and you want a little help and a quicker way to do things, then I have a library that I wrote that's really helpful for that, and it's called Double. So Double is installed just like any other module, but you only want to use it in test. Don't use it in production. It's totally not for anything but testing. It's important to call out, though, that Double doesn't do anything special. It's pretty much doing what we've been doing this whole time. It's just quicker, and it helps you build those modules that you're using to stub on the fly. It can also build maps and structs that you want to test with. It just makes it all a lot easier, and it solves some of those holes that I was talking about with processes and setting up subsequent call behavior, things like that. So let's clean this code up with Double. So we import it into our test suite, and then we're going to recreate this stub file module here. So we can do that by stub equals Double, and in this case we want to stub the file module. Now again, it doesn't override file, but passing the module that you're actually stubbing against allows it to verify that the functions you're defining actually exist, which is useful so you don't make mistakes. So we want to allow the read function, and we have the file name argument, and we want this to return this, and that. Now we don't need to do the send self thing. It does that for you. And then we just pass in stub. And then let's do this one too. So with this one, it'll be stub equals Double on file, allow read, and that's going to be okay, and the empty contents, and then we just pass in the stub, and we can leave these assert receives because the library does that for you now, so you don't need the boilerplate. And now we can completely remove this setup here, and it's good to go. And that's pretty much it. And I definitely encourage you to look at the documentation for Double, and you can see some of the more advanced setups that you can do and some of its more advanced features. I think it'll make your life a lot easier when you're doing this kind of testing. Alright, peace out.